At Jiahu, in the less plains of what is now Henan province, jars that had slept under earth for 7 millennia kept a secret that made people smile and groan for generations to come. Chemical traces of a fermented drink. Dated to roughly 7000 to 600 BCE, those painted pottery fragments yielded a molecular fingerprint, markers of rice and honey, of hawthorn and wild grape, that read like an ingredient list from deep antiquity. Patrick McGovern and an archaeological team in the early 21st century coaxed that story from tartaric acids and other biomarkers, and suddenly a domestic scene reappeared in the mind's eye. People breaking up a loaf of bread, stirring a porridge, scooping sticky honey into a jar, bearing the vessel for a time and discovering later that what bubbled had become a verb within itself. There is nothing theatrical in the discovery. It is quiet, accidental, and then, over the long arc of habit and curiosity, deliberate. The jars at Jiahu do more than suggest taste. They sit beside bone flutes unearthed in the same layers, and together they make a plausible picture of food and music and the hot, intimate sociality of a communal feast, where a shared cup meant warmth, stories, negotiation, and perhaps the beginnings of a sense of the sacred. This pattern, wild fruit, honey and grain meeting wild yeasts in the cool darkness of an earthen vessel, repeats itself across early Eurasia. In the South Caucasus, sites associated with the Shulaveri Shomu culture and settlements such as Gadakrili Gora show residues of great base fermentation dated to around 6000 BCE. In the Haiza Gros and the plains of western Iran, jars from Haji Firuz Tepe have yielded tartaric acid consistent with grape wine from roughly 5400 to 5000 BCE. Anatolian Neolithic settlements like Çatalhöyük, occupied between about 7500 and 5700 BCE, provide abundant grinding stones, hearths, and storage pits, whose architecture makes clear that cereals were being processed, stored, and transformed in ways that would let fermentation flourish. The archaeological record of pottery residues, chemical traces preserved in the matrix of clay, is an odd, intimate kind of writing. It tells us what people drank when all other texts are unreadable, what they sank their hands into and what they passed to kin. In those residues we find the first clear evidence that fermentation was not a one-off curiosity, but a reproducible technology, embedded in domestic practice from the first settled farms onward. The chemistry that makes alcohol a possibility is patient and democratic. Everywhere there are yeasts, and everywhere there are sugars waiting in grain, fruit, or nectar. The earliest human encounter with fermentation was plausibly a series of small accidents. A bowl of mashed grain set aside and warmed by the sun begins to sour. A crushed cluster of grapes in a storage amphora sits long enough to froth. A honey-sweetened porridge, watered down and forgotten, becomes cloudy and lifts its smell into the evening. Someone tasted it. Curiosity, appetite, ritual, the need to stretch scarce calories, any of a dozen motives, turned that taste from novelty into technique. Once people learned that a slurry left in a sealed jar would sweeten and lift the spirit, they began to manage the conditions, selecting vessels, timing the germination of grain to encourage malting, keeping certain jars for special days. The technology of fermentation is as much social engineering as it is chemistry. It requires shared expectations, a place to meet, and a system for distributing both the beverage and the marks of honour that come with supplying it. Those earliest fermented liquids performed several unglamorous but crucial jobs in the deep past. They were portable calories in a world still uncertain about the next harvest, a way to preserve the sugars of a season into something that could be sipped in the lean months. They mitigated the risk of waterborne pathogens in settlements where wells and surface water could harbour disease. Fermented beverages, by virtue of their alcohol and acidity, were often safer than water. They played into social economies as gifts and payments, as tools for hospitality and reconciliation, and as substances keyed into ritual, libations to ancestors, offerings to deities, components of funerary provision. At Jiahu, and in the Georgian Pithoi and in the Neolithic settlements of Anatolia, the material remains, buried jars, communal pits, the clustering of fine vessels, speak of occasions where large numbers gathered, where food was consumed as part of political life, marriage and remembrance. There is the sense that the invention of intentional fermentation changed the grammar of communal life. It extended the timbre of what people could give and receive, and it gave texture to social obligation. You make and share the beverage. You thereby acknowledge kinship, authority and debt. A mug passed around a fire binds in ways that we are only beginning to measure in bone chemistry and residue analysis. When Neolithic settlements multiplied and irrigation and surplus made possible denser population centres, that quiet household technology scaled into organised production. In the lowlands of Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley of Egypt, barley, emmer and other cereals were not merely crops, but the backbone of economies that demanded stable staples and reliable caloric throughput. The child of that cereal economy was beer, the barley-based, often thick and porridge-like brew that filled the cups of workers and gods alike. In Sumer, by the later 3rd millennium BCE and certainly by the Old Babylonian period, beer was not marginal. It was baked into the administrative mathematics of cities. Tablets from Uruk, Nippur and other city-states record allocations of barley and of beer in formulaic lists. Soldiers received so many measures, temple personnel so many, workers on a building project so many. In the hymn to Ninkasi, a Sumerian song that survives in Old Babylonian copies, yet clearly slips its techniques from an older world, brewing itself is personified and praised. The hymn sings of bapir, twice-baked barley loaves crushed and mixed, of the steaming of the mash, of the filtering through reed mats, and of the cup that rings with foam. The poem reads at once like devotion and like a recipe, and within its stanzas you can hear a city where production, ritual, and taste have braided together. Brewing in those early urban economies was both domestic and industrial. Women were at the centre of the practice. The term for the beer mistress recurs in both Mesopotamian and Egyptian records, and pictorial scenes show women pouring, stirring, and kneading. In households, the role of the brewster gave women a measured authority over a critical household product. In temples and palaces, brew houses with rows of vats and ovens suggest a scale far beyond a single hearth. In Egypt, Middle Kingdom settlements such as Kahun preserved the remains of bakeries and breweries close to worker villages for royal pyramid projects, where ovens and vats lay in orderly rows, and where the logistics of feeding an army of labour required a steady production line of loaves and jugs. In the New Kingdom, Ostraka and papyri from Deir el-Medina record rations of bread and beer to skilled artisans, and in Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom burials, jars of beer accompany the dead as funerary provisions. Tutankhamun's tomb contained vessels inscribed with the names of brews and vintages, a little pantry of afterlife comforts. Brewing here is not a backwater craft, it is an economy, a ritual technology, and frequently a woman's work, if work can be measured by its social reach. The mechanics of ancient brewing, as preserved in texts and images, reveal an economy of technique that was remarkably pragmatic. Barley was sprouted to mobilize starches into sugars, then dried. Bapir, loafed bread made for the brew, was baked and sometimes stored. That bread or malt was then crumbled into water and warmed until a porridge formed. Fermentation followed when porridge or must was left to sit in jars with wild yeasts doing the slow alchemy. Filtration through reed mats or sieves produced a cupable liquid. The result was often not the clear beer we prize today, but a cloudy, nutrient-rich beverage, more soup than spirit and calorically substantial. It was drunk through reed straws and shared from communal bowls in many contexts. The Sumerians measured their beer in units, seela and gur, and used it as a unit of reward. The bureaucrats of temples and palaces became brewers of sorts, ensuring that rations matched output and that the flows of grain and brew served the wider apparatus of office and cult. That apparatus had weight. Grain surpluses underwrote priestly and royal households, paid soldiers, and sustained construction projects. Where the state could arrange irrigation and collect taxes in grain, it could guarantee breweries enough raw material to make the city run. Beer became a circulating medium in those early economies, useful not only for nourishment, but as a tool of redistribution. A granary that could convert grain into a palatable, distributable drink held political leverage. Workers are fed, but by that feeding they are also bound into obligations and expectancies. The brewhouse is a node in the web of authority, and because brewing required space, fuel and labour, it was one site where centralisation naturally took hold. The social life of beer-fed hierarchies. Temples claimed exclusive rights to certain types of brew, taverns offered a market for surplus, an administrative list tabulated the proper allocation to priests, to soldiers, even to prisoners. Taverns existed in these societies, and they too were places of public sociability, exchange, and occasional trouble. Cuneiform records refer to houses of beer where people gathered, and sometimes the law scribes bothered to regulate them. Who had the right to run a house of beer, what could be sold, and what penalties applied for cheating the public. Taverns were inevitably centres of rumour. They were where labourers met, where alliances could be forged, and where the state tended to glance warily, because drink lubricates tongues and loosens reticence. That said, archaeological and textual evidence also show that much of brewing remained domestic or temple-run. The tavern was part of a larger spectrum rather than the whole industry. The Nile knew beer too, in its own registers of taste and authority. In Egypt, brewing tied into the cycle of the inundation and the calendar of labour. When the flood receded and crops were sown, breweries were busy, and when harvest came, the jars filled. Large-scale brewery installations accompany cemeteries of workmen. Scenes in tombs depict women crushing grain and stirring the brew as part of the necessary labours that support the tomb owner's Ka. The deity Hathor, sometimes merry and sometimes wrathful, associates with intoxication in myths, where beer is used to placate dangerous forces. There are temple accounts showing beer poured into sanctuaries as an offering. In the practical domain, the provision of beer to the workforce, whether the quarrymen who cut stone for pyramids or the artisans who carved tombs, was an essential part of project management in ancient Egypt. To withhold rations was to threaten productivity. To ensure them was to secure loyalty. Here again, a fermented beverage is revealed as a managerial tool as much as a pleasure. If beer anchored food security and statecraft in river valleys, wine found its cultural moment in the thinner, sunburnt soils of the Mediterranean, where grapevines climbed terraces, and where maritime trade made a vine's product portable and profitable. On Crete, at Knossos and in other Minoan centres from around 2000 to 1400 BCE, frescoes celebrate harvest, the treading of grapes, and large storage pithoi suggestive of palace economies, where wine fed elites and sanctuaries. The Mycenaeans, inheriting Minoan tastes, left Linear B tablets, administrative scrolls that list allocations of oinos, the word for wine, to palatial storekeepers. Wine's texture of taste, its capacity to be aged, flavoured and parcelled, made it particularly suited to the cultures that would become Greek city-states. By the archaic and classical periods, the Greeks had woven wine into ritual, politics and philosophy. The symposium, an institution of male elite sociability that flourished between roughly the 8th and 4th centuries BCE, was as much a political forum as a party. Men reclined on couches around a crater, and the kykeon of conversation mixed with actual wine. Symposia shaped patronage networks, philosophical argument, and artistic performance. Plato's Symposium, no mere historical account, but a philosophical text that uses the form of a drinking party to examine eros and truth, attests to how central the setting was to elite discourse. Ritual libation, too, was core. At religious ceremonies, wine was poured to honour the gods, and the Dionysian cults made intoxication a sacramental gateway in rites of release and initiatory experience. There was a moral grammar to wine as well. The Greeks famously diluted wine with water and regarded drinking unmixed as a mark of barbarians or madness. and these practices encoded social identity as clearly as language. Viticulture spread alongside colonists and traders. Greeks established outposts at Massalia, modern Marseille, in the 6th century BCE. Phoenician mariners planted vines along Iberian coasts. Carthaginian centres nurtured their own vineyards. With colonisation went a horticultural experiment. Transplant a grape cultivar from island to mainland, match vine to soil, learn the trellising that suits a slope. Within a few centuries, wine had become not simply the luxury of elites, but a regional economic mainstay in parts of southern Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. Amphorae, tall, tapered ceramic jars, carried wine across sea lanes, their stamped handles and painted tituli inscriptions, often recording origin, producer, and vintage enough to make a rudimentary commodity market. Rome, inheriting both Greek taste and Etruscan practice, industrialised viticulture in its own way and deployed the vine as one of the Roman world's most mobile commodities. From the Middle Republic into the Empire, the production of wine scales up. Estates or villata rustici specialise, latifundia concentrate production, militarised colonisation plants, vineyards in Spain, Gaul and Africa. Writers of agronomy, Cato the Elder with his De Agricultura around 60 BCE, Varro in the late Republic and Columella in the 1st century CE, offer manuals on trellising, grafting, pruning and vinification that show a highly developed technical knowledge. Pliny the Elder in his Natural History catalogues famous wines and their reputed qualities, Falernian, Secuban, Chian, among others, and in his lists one can read the formation of a market of terroirs and reputations. The Roman state did not simply passively accept this spread. It regulated, taxed, stamped, and sometimes subsidised. Amphorae from Baetica, from Rhodes, from Chios, and from Italian ports move in a vast network whose scale becomes visible in shipwrecks and in the odd archaeological ledger, such as Monte Testaccio in Rome, a great artificial hill composed of millions of broken amphorae, an industrial midden that testifies to the daily consumption of oil and wine by a massive urban population. Technologies travelled with tastes. Where Mediterranean producers could not easily ship whole casks on narrow creaking hulls, clay amphorae served. They were sealed with resin or pitch to protect the wine from air and sea. Romans, whose palate could be both fastidious and pragmatic, favoured aged wines for their prestige, but also drank freshly pressed wine for everyday use, sometimes mixing it with water, sometimes heating and spicing it for medicinal and gustatory effects. The ancients experimented with condiments and preservation. Boiled down musts like defrutum and sapa concentrated sweetness and served as flavouring or preservative. Spices and resins were common adjuncts. And, less nobly, some winemakers used lead vessels or lead-reduced must as a sweetener, a practice that modern scholars have linked, cautiously and not without controversy, to chronic lead exposure in certain strata of Roman society. Wine was medicine as well. In the Hippocratic Corpus, wine is both a solvent and a tonic, and Galen uses wine as a medium for delivering drugs. Yet there is also a steady thread of caution about drunkenness and excess. Wine's social grammar in Greece and Rome was elaborate. The Greeks taught moderation in mixing. They used the symposium to manage status by seating order and cup sequence. The Romans, with their more public conviviality, banquets that could be ostentatious, and taverns that could be rowdy, had different idioms. The Bacchanalia scandal of 186 BCE, recorded by Livy, shows Rome's unease when ecstatic rites associated with Dionysian worship were perceived as places where political subversion and moral license might flourish. The Senate's clampdown is telling because it reveals how important the governance of ritualized intoxication could be to the survival of public order. Wine could be a civilizing badge, a local pride, a taxable good, and occasionally a threat. All of this, fermentation in buried jars and reed-filtered porridge, temple vats and palace pithoi, amphoria stamped with origins and amphitheatres of drinking, accomplished a long, slow project. It made alcohol a technology of human sociality. From Jiahu's mixed brew, which probably warmed hands and loosened tongues in the dim of communal houses, to the Sumerian breweries that fed the hydraulics of the first states, to the terraced vineyards of the Mediterranean whose products travelled in encaustic amphorae, to the tables of magistrates and sailors, fermented beverages stitched together landscapes, labour, ritual and law. They made palates and profits alike. They created professions, brewers, vintners, coopers, tavern keepers, and literatures from hymns and recipe poems to agronomic compendia. They shaped legal instruments and fiscal regimes because anything worth drinking tends in time to be worth taxing. In the quiet hours when the last amphora is tipped and the great test of taste, age versus freshness, terroir versus technique, has been argued into slumber, one can still follow the track of jars and nests of reed through the archaeology and the texts. The basic human equation remains simple. Sugar plus yeast plus patience equals a new social tool. What changed in the Bronze and Iron Ages was scale. And with scale came specialisation and the cultural genres that attend to taste. Literature about vintages, laws about adulteration, gods invoked and implicated with the very liquids they seem to inspire. The Sumerian hymn to Ninkasi treats brewing as sacred and practical in the same breath. The Greek lyric and the Roman treatise move between sensual praise and sober technique. It is a long-running conversation between what we can do in the kitchen and what we can build with the surplus that those kitchens produce. If there is a final oddity to note as night deepens, it is this. The same ferment that made feasts possible also made new obligations inevitable. A jar buried at Jiahu became part of a story of kinship and ritual. A brewery in Ur became part of the ledger that bound citizens to work. A vineyard in Campania swelled into an export that helped build an empire. Fermentation is simple and domestic, and yet it has always had this imperial potential. The first jars preserved a taste. Subsequent institutions preserved an order. In that sense, tracing the history of alcohol from ancient accidental sips to the organised economies of beer and wine is to watch something modest accrete into structures of power, taste and law. And because humans are, even at their most organised, creatures of appetite and habit, the jars keep breaking and the recipes keep adapting. Every glass handed across a table is an inheritance and an experiment. The world we think of as civilized learned to measure itself in part by how it produced and regulated what it drank. Along the broad sweep of the Yellow and Yangtze river valleys, in the damp reed beds and the warm hollows where rice and millet grew in patient abundance, people learned early that starch could be coaxed into sweetness, sweetness into foam, and foam into another kind of heat. Archaeologists like to point to Jiahu in northern Henan, a Neolithic site dated to roughly 7000 to 6600 BCE, where residue found in pottery jars smells in the mind like a first experiment. Traces of rice, honey and fruit, a mingling of wild yeasts that one can imagine speechless hands stirring in the dim. That residue is not merely chemical, it is the fingerprint of a habit forming. It tells us that long before written law or royal banquets, there were drinks that passed from hand to hand, from vessel to mouth, that altered mood and tightened social bonds. In China, the word jiu would come to stand for all such liquids, and by the age of bronze, the forms of ceremony had caught up with the taste. Bronze vessels, the zhuo, the guang, the zun, appear in tombs of the Shang and Zhou, roughly 1600 to 221 BCE, their shapes tailored to pour and heat and to make an offering to ancestors. The Book of Songs sings of cups and toasts, the ritual manuals of the Zhou record wine as essential to ancestor worship, and one can still hear, if one listens softly, bowls clinking and the dusty echo of court halls. The technologies were, as technologies must be, local and inventive. In the millets of the north and the rice terraces of the south, different problems required different answers. Grain stores, humid summers, the predatory insects, these pressed fermenters to refine their methods. One of the great Chinese innovations was the use of ku, cakes of grain that carried with them a community of moulds and yeasts, a method of saccharification that turned starch into sugar without malting. Kyrkyu and its cousins are the quiet genius of East Asian fermentation. By nursing and drying cultures of Aspergillus and other organisms, Resort brewers could mash rice or millet and have enzymes on hand to do the work that malted barley does in the West. The agricultural treatise Chimin Yaoshu, compiled by Jia Sixi in the mid-6th century CE, lays out recipes and methods in patient detail, how to steam, how to cool, how to judge the day when jars would rise with life. The images that survive, pottery jars sealed with wax, earthenware pits lined with straw, steam rising from a wooden mash tun, say as plainly as any recipe that this was daily work as much as ritual. Across India, the story runs on a different set of rhythms, but with the same human impulse. The Rig Veda, composed and gathered in verses between roughly 1500 and 1200 BCE, and sung for generations thereafter, is filled with ecstatic references to soma, a pressed, sacred liquid that priests offered to gods, and to which gods themselves were said to be addicted. Ritual instructions in those hymns describe pressing, mixing, and offering, and the word soma becomes a hinge around which theology and intoxication turn. What soma actually was, whether an efflorescent plant, a mushroom, an opiate, or a concoction now impossible to reconstruct exactly, is a debate that has engaged philologists and botanists and, in its stubborn ambiguity, reveals the breadth of ancestral experiment. By the later Vedic periods, another set of intoxicants has taken on public life. Sura and Madhya, the words for stronger drinks that appear in law codes and household manuals, and that cluster around social functions and punishments alike. The story of alcohol in South Asia is therefore both cosmological and eminently practical. Palm wines, tadi, kalu, tari, are tapped from coconut and palmyra trees along the coast. Rice ferments bubble in upland villages. Toddy tapping is at once a livelihood and a ritual skill, handed down in families and practiced on scaffolds at dawn when the air is thin. Ayurvedic texts, which unfold a taxonomy of tastes and temperaments across centuries, treat fermented preparations as remedies, infusions of herbs in wine to dissolve a phlegm, warming cordials to steady a weak stomach, tinctures to ease pain. Medicine and merriment are neighbours here, sometimes the same house. Southeast Asia, touched by monsoon and tide, becomes a crucible in which rice and palm and maritime exchange form new beverages and new customs. On the islands of the Indonesian archipelago, the fermented rice known as tapai, and its close kin brem in Bali, are both sustenance and sacrament. Tapai, sticky rice inoculated with ragi, a starter culture often grown on banana leaves, is sweet and lively, meant to be eaten and shared, used in ceremonies that range from the domestic to the consecrated. In the Malay world, tuak, made from palm sap, perfumed the longhouses and the palace courts of the Srivijaya and later Malacca, where sailors, merchants and priests tasted of the same cup. In the Burmese highlands and the Tibetan plateaus, barley beers like shang rise with steam and are drunk from shared bowls, their yeasty breath warming the cold. The starter cultures vary in name, Nuruk in Korea, Ragi in Indonesia, Kui in China, and yet the idea is the same: capture the right microbes, feed them cooked starch, let them sing. And because these cultures are local and portable, they travel in the clothes and jars of people as the larger networks of trade move, the coastal ships, the riverine junks, the caravans that thread the archipelagic geography of exchange. It is worth pausing on that travel. Between the 7th and 15th centuries, the Indian Ocean becomes a kind of highway for fermentable ideas. Ports like Guangzhou and Quanzhou on the Chinese coast, Calicut on the Malabar shore, Palembang and Srivijaya in Sumatra, and later Malacca and Ayutthaya are stops on a circuit where not only spices and silks change hands, but recipes and implements. A Persian trader will see Kyrkyu and think of his own sourdough starters. An Arab alchemist will demonstrate a copper still and leave the design to a Chinese metallurgist who adapts it to distill medicinal waters. Distillation, when it appears, is less a single invention than a meeting of older practices with new apparatus. The Arabic alchemists, Jabir ibn Hayyan and his followers between the 8th and 10th centuries, refine the alembic and write about concentrating essences and making aqua vitae, water of life, that extracts the volatile heart of plant material. That idea migrates, sometimes as men and women carry objects and instruction manuals, sometimes as the logic of medicine suggests useful technology. By the medieval and early modern periods, distillation will be local practice in many Asian societies, transformed for local taste into strong spirits such as China's later baijiu or the palm and rice araks of Southeast Asia. But in most of the early history, the region knows alcohol as fermentation. Household jars, village breweries, temple libations. Those jars inhabit shrine rooms and kitchens alike. The most persistent lesson across these Asian landscapes is that alcohol, whatever its chemistry, acquires meaning through use. It becomes a sacrament in one place, medicine in another, a staple at harvest in yet another. China, the ritual of the ancestor tablets and the wine cup, is a way of remaking bonds across generations. To pour is to remember, and to drink is to affirm the social order. In India, the Soma hymns and later tantric rites place intoxicants at the throat of divinity, sometimes as a surface of vision, sometimes as a test of loyalty. In the rice terraces of Southeast Asia, a jar opened at the new rice festival is as the hinge between the earth's gift and human celebration. A communal bowl passed beneath the moon creates a temporary solidarity, a temporality of the inebriate that both loosens and binds. The historical record, pottery shards stained with tart sugars, verses set down in sacred texts, travel accounts of sailors who wrote with thirst upon their tongues, gives us an economy of uses rather than a single story. That economy feeds directly into a larger and older set of human arrangements, religion and medicine. Across Eurasia, alcoholic liquids slide between altar and apothecary, like a single substance with two names. They are poured into the earth as libation to the dead and into the mouths of the living as cure. They are saluted as divine and chastised as devilish. This is not simple hypocrisy. It is a sustained ambivalence rooted in the dual capacity of alcohol to open lines of feeling and to undo social order. The Greeks had Dionysus and the wine-dark sea. The Romans had Bacchic rites, which the state at times banned, because unregulated communal intoxication threatened civic authority. The Hebrew scriptures contain wine in blessing and ale in admonition. Rabbinic law regulates consumption carefully. In the Christian world, the question becomes theological. Wine's central place in the Eucharist, instituted in the Gospels and elaborated in patristic doctrine, makes fermented grape not merely a beverage but a visible sign of grace, the blood of Christ made present. That sacramental reality protects wine inside church walls, even as ascetic writers warn of the sin of drunkenness. Saint Benedict in the 6th century counsels moderation in drinking, but insists on hospitality. The monastery must provide for the wayfarer. Augustine and other church fathers will echo the caution that the flesh is weak and the spirit must be master. Yet the daily life of monasteries, so often the repository of culinary and technical know-how, treats wine and beer as practical resources, fuel for hospital patients, preservative for medicines, and an acceptable beverage for lay brothers who have to perform manual work. The religious ambivalence is especially visible in the Islamic world, where the sacred law that prohibits intoxicants sits beside a highly developed medicinal and alchemical culture. The Quran and the Hadiths make clear that intoxication is morally fraught, yet Arab and Persian physicians and chemists across the medieval centuries treat distillation as a technical and medicinal enterprise. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, 980 to 1037, writes in the Canon of Medicine about the use of preserved and distilled wines as carriers for plant medicines and as therapeutic agents in their own right. Rhazes, Al-Razi, and Athiz describe the use of distilled alcohols as solvents and as antiseptics. The apparent contradiction, one set of authorities forbids the drink and another refines the art of making it, is less a paradox than a partitioning of function. For perfume, for lotion, for a tincture to be applied to a wound, alcohol is a marvel. For the convivial table, it is a forbidden fruit. In practice, people navigate the slope between these poles, and sometimes the clinical language of medicine becomes a permissive cloak. If a distillation heals, the ink of the physician's treatise makes it permissible in a way that the reveller's cup may not be. Medicine more broadly shores up alcohol's place in society. From Hippocratic recipes in the classical Mediterranean to Galenic humoral theory onward, wine is a primary solvent, an agent of digestion, and an instrument to modify the temperament. Galen himself, living in the 2nd century CE, classifies wines by warmth and moisture, prescribing one for melancholia, another for the cold and phlegmatic. This system survives and permeates medieval medical practice in both Europe and the Islamic writings that would later be translated into Latin. The practicalities are simple. Many active plant substances are soluble in alcohol. Tinctures maintained for seasons where water would sour. Apothecaries steeped herbs in wine to make cordials and electuaries. The aqua vitae distilled by alchemists becomes a concentrated carrier for their recipes. It is no accident that when men later name strong spirits, they often call them names that translate to water of life, from aqua vitae to Gaelic uisce beartha to the Scottish whisky, for the distillate does indeed allow the pharmacopoeia's power to be concentrated. Religions respond to these medical and social functions with a mixture of theological principle and pragmatic regulation. Buddhism's 5 precepts include abstaining from intoxicants that cloud the mind, and yet the practice of Buddhism across Asia is heterogeneous enough to show both strict avoidance and localized permissiveness. Tibetan tantric rituals, for instance, have long made ritual use of chang or offerings of barley grog, substances that are symbolically potent in a tradition where the body is a vehicle for liberation. Hinduism likewise contains both a suspicion of intoxication, seen in many orthodox Brahmanical prescriptions, and ritual exceptions, notably within Shakta and Tantric groups where wine and meat supply what textual orthodoxy often forbids to the householder. The point is not to scandalize, but to show that symbolic meaning is always contextual. Alcohol may be a sacrament in one ritual and a sin in another, an antiseptic in the surgeon's tent and an instrument of revelry in the village square. Very practical, everyday logics also underlie the sacred rhetoric. Water in many pre-modern towns was an unpredictable companion. Fermentation by reducing microbial load and locking the liquid into ethanol made some beverages safer than water. Small beer, low in alcohol yet warm and nutritious, becomes a staple for labourers in Northern Europe, an unglamorous yet essential source of calories and hydration. In agrarian Asia, rice wine fills a similar niche, caloric, warming and safe. To this day, many ritual acts that call for an offering of liquid are also acts of social provisioning, ensuring the distribution of the year's surplus grain in a form that is both preservable and portable. Health, piety and economy are braided together in a way that resists any simple moralizing. And then Europe's medieval villages and cloisters, their timbered houses smelling of grain and smoke, take these long precedents and make them into a different kind of social architecture. Monastic communities, Benedictine, Cistercian, and later Augustinian houses, preserve texts and practice the arts of cultivation and fermentation with a rigorous eye. The famous Plan of St. Gall, drawn about 820-830 CE, includes among its careful rooms a brewhouse, a sign that the liturgical life of the monastery, which included service to the poor and hospitality for pilgrims, demanded a well-ordered production of fermented drinks. Monasteries had granaries, malt houses, herb gardens and infirmaries. They were reservoirs of technical knowledge. Monks copied classical texts and adapted them. They grafted vines on terraces, and in places like Burgundy, the Cistercians and Benedictines would develop viticulture that shaped regional tastes for centuries to come. Hildegard of Bingen, 1098-1179, abbess and polymath, wrote extensively about medicinal plants and recommended wines infused with herbs to treat a range of ailments. Her theory of health, like Galen's, married temperament to taste. Yet brewing in medieval Europe is not only a monastic pursuit. For most people it is domestic female-centred work for centuries. Alewives, the women who brewed at home for their households and sometimes for sale, preside over the cooker and the mash, a role that makes the household kitchen a microeconomy. As towns grow and the demand for consistent production increases, brewing professionalizes and moves out of the domestic hearth into purpose-built brew houses, increasingly dominated by men as capital and scale change the gender balance. Urban guilds form to regulate the trade. Men who make a livelihood of brewing join organisations, the Brewers' Guilds, that control training, set standards, and lobby for privileges. The Assize of Bread and Ale in England, a legal framework that applied price and quality checks to common staples, is one of many municipal techniques to keep foodstuffs affordable and to police the behaviour of sellers. Ale Connors, local officers, taste and test. Town councils license inns and alehouses, concerned as much with public order as with revenue. The public house becomes a communal furnace for rumour and contract, for courtship and complaint, for the slow workings of civic life. A technological story runs alongside these social shifts. Beer and ale diverge in taste in part because of the slow adoption of hops. Before hops became common, many northern European brews used Groot, a blend of bitter herbs such as bog myrtle, yarrow and juniper, to balance sweetness and preserve liquid. Hops, with their bittering resins and antibacterial properties, gradually transformed the product. Hopped beer lasted longer and travelled farther. The Hallertau and other German hop-growing regions sowed a crop that by the later medieval centuries would become central to beer's transformation into a tradable commodity. Hopped beer could cross rivers and coasts with less spoilage, and that opened markets. Municipal and Hanseatic towns in the North Sea and Baltic traded in malt and beer as if they were a single commodity line, and with that trade came regulations and taxes. The Reinheitsgebot of 1516, decisively later than the medieval period but part of the same arc, would legislate purity in Bavaria, naming water, barley and hopters as beer's only lawful constituents. The law is the endpoint of a longer process in which farmers, brewers, merchants and magistrates argue over quality, price and scarcity. Behind every cup are logistics. Grain must be grown and malted on kilns that require wood and labour. Millers and coopers are as necessary as brewers. The cask is both container and commerce. Seasonal cycles dictate production. Malted barley must be stored, or hops harvested and dried, wort-boiled in a communal kettle. The economy of a medieval town is visible in these small operations, the baker's oven, and the brewer's mash tun breathing in the same courtyard, the alehouse with its lined benches, and the market with its prices set by the town crier. When a lord lays claim to the right to brew, or when a municipality licenses a certain number of taverns, the decision is as much about controlling supplies and levying taxes as it is about policing morality. Ale becomes a fiscal instrument as often as a social one, and so the medieval world, for all its piety, its agricultural labour, and its slow-moving law courts, makes room for alcohol as a daily and decisive thing. It is the warm measure at the end of a harvest day. It is the medicinal cordial in the infirmary. It is the sacrament in the chapel. It is also, inevitably, the fuel for excess. That tension between the functional and the fantastic, between necessity and hazard, is ancient, and it knots together the human story from the rice jars of Jiahu to the brewhouses of St. Gall. Across Asia, the Middle East and Europe alike, fermented and later distilled beverages have been the vehicles for exchange, of ideas, of microbes, of ritual forms, of law. They travel in the hulls of ships and the hands of pilgrims. They appear in treaties and in hospital lists. They bind monasteries to markets and temples to taverns. If there is a dark little joke the past tells us, it is this. Wherever you have grain enough to spare, you will have someone curious enough to produce a drink that will be called sacred by some, medical by others, and recreational by almost everyone. The more serious story beneath the joke is larger and more intricate. It is a story of logistics and scale, of how societies learn to move calories, control fermentation, and organise labour so that a village could be provisioned, a monastery hospitable, a market profitable. It is a story of scales of meaning, a cup that cleansed a wound in the infirmary, was the same shape of cup used in a wedding feast, and so the boundary between piety, healing, and pleasure remained porous, and it is a story of technical transfer, of starters and stills moving along with merchants, of monks copying herbal cures from Arabic physicians who themselves had inherited Hellenic humoral frameworks, of coastal ports mapping not only goods but tastes. We end, if we can say the word, with scale. One jar in a tomb, one hymn to Soma, one monastic plan. Each might be a fragment. Stitched together they form a continent-wide tapestry. The fermenting jar in a Southeast Asian house, warm rim, the faint whiff of yeast and banana leaf starter, is the same human project as the copper alembic smoked by an Arabic alchemist, or the oak vessel rolled from coopered staves in a Flemish cellar. In every case, people faced resources and needs, seasonality and storage, ritual and remedy. They learned to harness microbes by trial and error, to institutionalize production when scales demanded, and to frame usage in words of sanctity or sickness, depending on what their scriptures and doctors told them. There is a stubborn practicality in that human thread. Drinkers and brewers managed the world with taste as much as law, and long before industrialization their small technologies of fermentation and distillation knit together economies and rights. The tale is not moralizing. It has no simple hero. It has instead a chain of choices and accidents, of jars and books and salted letters between ports. It tells us that a drink is often more than its chemistry, that it carries with it the climate of a valley, the law of a city, and the liturgy of a temple. And it tells us softly that the history of alcohol is a history of human ingenuity and human contradiction, an art of turning grain and fruit into comfort and communion, into medicine and mischief, with consequences as intimate as a sleep well earned and as wide as the trade routes that cup the world in motion. In the dim glass-paned rooms of Hellenistic Alexandria, and in the shadowed corners of early Egyptian workshops, craftsmen and thinkers first began to notice that vapours could be coaxed from liquids and caught again, yielding something other than the fragrant oils and perfumes they had chased for centuries. It's easy to imagine the clink of glass, the pear-shaped curves of primitive retorts catching the flame's light, the curious eyes of artisans leaning close as scented steam curled into cool receiver flasks. Those were experiments of patience and intuition, more than a formal theory, a shepherding of smoke into liquid, a catching of essence. Zosimos of Panopolis, writing in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, described apparatus that looked strikingly modern in outline. Maria the Jewess, Maria Prophetessa, was credited in later medieval sources with gadgets that anticipated components of the alembic, devices that allowed alchemists to concentrate essences. These Hellenistic and late antique artisans did not distill alcohol in any widespread domestic sense, but they moved the technology forward. They taught the world how to separate and recombine, how to watch for the sweet point when a volatile spirit would part company from its watery companion and condense back into a liquid of a different character. That empirical inheritance found a new home and a new urgency in the laboratories of the Islamic world. In cities such as Kufa and later the cosmopolitan hubs of Baghdad and Cairo, scholars gathered in the House of Wisdom and in private ateliers to translate, test and improve on those Hellenistic recipes. By the 8th and 9th centuries, the culture of inquiry that gathered under the Abbasids had produced refinements that were both conceptual and material. Metal workers and glassblowers learned to fashion better cucurbits and receivers. Chemists and physicians learned how to control heat and condensation. Jabir ibn Hayyan, known to Europeans later as Geber, a figure associated with a prodigious corpus of alchemical work around the late 8th to early 9th century, wrote at length about distillation and apparatus. Al-Razi, or Rhazes, c. 854-925, the Persian polymath, described techniques for concentrating substances and extracting active principles. And it was this milieu that coined and shaped many of the words we still use. Alambic gave us alembic. Alcool, once referring to a fine powder used as cosmetic or antimear, shifted in meaning and helped give rise to the European alcohol. These were not purely abstract pursuits. distillation was put to immediate practical use in the pharmacy. Physicians discovered that when wines or herbal macerations were gently heated and the vapours collected, the resulting liquid could serve as a solvent for plant medicines, an antiseptic, or a storable concentrate of therapeutic properties. Distilled liquid condensed into a stronger, purer drink, one that preserved herbal tinctures and kept them from putrefying in warm climates. The region's alchemists and physicians argued, tested, and sometimes disagreed about how to apply these potent waters. Some regarded them with suspicion. Others, like the many practical apothecaries in Andalusia and Baghdad, stocked aqua vitae for wounds, for digestion, for fortifying tonics. When the Arabic treatises made their slow journey westward, through Sicily, Spain, and then across to Salerno and Paris, they arrived in a Europe that was rebuilding its intellectual infrastructure. The translation movement in Toledo in the 12th century, the work of figures like Gerard of Cremona and Constantine the African earlier in the 11th century, and the porous multilingual courts of Norman Sicily created corridors through which not only philosophy, but also technical know-how flowed. Latin scholars in the medical schools of Salerno and Montpellier found in Arabic alchemical manuals a repertoire of glass and copper technologies. Monastic infirmaries and urban apothecaries adopted these devices. The alembic became an implement in the medicinal arts. By the 13th and 14th centuries, European physicians such as Arnold of Villanova advocated for the use of distilled spirits as remedies, and the Franciscan John of Rupescissa, living through the calamity of the mid-14th century, insisted that the quintessence of wine, the concentrated spirit distilled from wine, was a form of medicine, and, he hoped, a means of resistance against the plague. There is something quietly ironic in the phrase aqua vitae, or water of life, for distilled alcohol began in learned, sometimes pious settings as a curative and preservative, rather than as an enticement to revelry. Yet the material itself, once available, proved difficult to confine to apothecaries. Technologically, the leap from fermented beer and wine to intentionally distilled alcohol was less a single inventive flash than a series of improvements in metallurgy, glass-making and thermal control. Early alembics made of glass and pottery gave way in many regions to copper stills and more complex condensers. The ability to maintain moderate heat, to control reflux, and to capture a fraction that boiled at a lower temperature than water, all made a more potent spirit possible. This was a material revolution as much as a theoretical one. Copper's thermal conductivity, experienced still keepers' feel for flame, and the skill of coopers and glassblowers together produced vessels that could survive repeated runs and deliver consistent spirits. The distilled products were heterogeneous and local in character. Aqua vitae in Latin manuscripts, brandy in coastal trading towns, schnapps in German hinterlands, arak and arak in the eastern trade winds, shaped by what each region fermented. Wine yielded brandies and eau de vie, grains yielded schnapps, or, in Eastern Europe, early forms of what would become vodka. Palm wine and fermented rice in Asia sometimes met distillation to produce local spirits. The social and economic consequences were immediate and often surprising. In the pharmacy, spirits lengthened the shelf life of tinctures and allowed concentrations of botanicals that previously spoiled within days. For long-distance travellers and soldiers, spirits were lighter, more caloric per barrel and less likely to sour than beer or fresh water. They could be carried in smaller volumes and rationed. For merchants, distilled beverages could be concentrated into smaller casks, reducing freight costs and making carriage overland or overseas more economical. For states, distilled spirits proved to be a convenient object of taxation. Excise and licensing could be levied at distilleries, at retail points and on shipments, creating a steady stream of revenue for crowns and municipalities that were always in need of funds for war, administration and patronage. Distillation, in short, was not just a chemical advance but a logistical one. It changed what fit into a barrel and what could be sent across an ocean. That change becomes particularly visible when we follow the smell of molasses and the trail of sugarcane into the age of global exploration. Sugar itself had long histories, cultivated in South and Southeast Asia, carried into the Mediterranean by Arab agriculture, and occupying as luxury good in medieval Europe. But the logistical and financial machinery of plantation sugar took a new shape with early modern colonialism. From the Portuguese experiments on Madeira and the Atlantic islands in the 15th century to the seizure and transformation of Caribbean islands by English, French, Spanish, and Dutch colonists in the 16th and 17th centuries, sugar plantations evolved into capital-intensive enterprises that married land, technology, and coerced labour into an export machine. Mills turned stalks into juice. Boiling houses concentrated that juice into crystals. The byproduct, molasses, flowed in muddy streams and vats, a viscous residue that had little value as sugar, but enormous potential as fermentable matter. It took a few decades for planters and enterprising distillers to turn molasses into alcohol, but when they did, rum was born. Rum's first clear appearances are in the 17th century English Caribbean. Barbados, colonised in the 1620s and 1630s, had by mid-century become a sugar-driven economy. Jamaica followed after its capture in 1655. The work of cane to sugar was organised on an industrial scale for its time. Wind or animal-powered mills crushed cane. Boiling houses reduced cane juice to crystals. Hogsheads and puncheons filled and were shipped across the Atlantic. Molasses, once it accumulated, was mixed with water, fermented, sometimes using dunder, the spent lees from previous fermentations, and then distilled in simple pot stills to produce a fiery spirit. Names shifted as much as methods. New Englanders, English sailors, and Caribbean planters called the product rum, rumbullion, kill devil, terms that reflected both affection and exasperation with the potent liquid. The result was a new commodity that fit neatly into the triangular trade. Sugar and rum flowed to Europe and the mainland colonies. Rum and manufactured goods sailed to West Africa in exchange for enslaved people, and those human commodities were transported to the plantations where their labour converted land into sugar and molasses. It is necessary to state this plainly, and to state it without the theatricality that history sometimes brings to suffering. The logistics of sugar and rum were integrated with systems of trade, chartered companies, and imperial policy that relied on human chattel and immense capital commitments. The Royal African Company, chartered in 1672 under the aegis of the English Crown, and the Dutch West India Company earlier in the century, organised and profited from these exchanges. Planters borrowed money, insured cargoes with merchants and nascent insurance institutions, and built infrastructures, roads, wharves, mills, that looked like industry long before the Industrial Revolution. Rum quickly became more than a local byproduct. In New England, distilleries in Boston, Newport and Salem took Caribbean molasses and converted it into rum that fed local markets and international circuits. New England merchants, using credit and connections with shipping networks, sent rum to Africa as part of cargoes to purchase enslaved people. This was triangular trade in practice and calculation. The Molasses Act of 1733, passed by the British Parliament, attempted to skew this commerce in favour of imperial planters by imposing heavy duties on non-British molasses. The law was as much an attempt to protect the British sugar islands as it was an instrument of mercantilist revenue. New England merchants evaded those duties by smuggling or by increased trade with British planters, and the law bred resentment and complex evasion strategies that would accumulate into colonial grievances later in the century. By the mid-18th century, the sugar-rum complex had woven disparate geographies together. Caribbean fields, New England distilleries, African coasts, and European markets all depended upon one another in circuits of goods and capital. On the ships that plied these routes, rum carved a cultural as well as economic niche. Sailors prized a daily ration of spirits because it fortified small men for cold and work, because it could be diluted to disguise poor water, because it calmed the cabin fever of long voyages. The Royal Navy's association with rum, and later with diluted rum, grog, a watered-down mixture introduced by Admiral Edward Vernon in 1740 to curb drunkenness, became a maritime practice that shaped the discipline and morale of crews. Ships' logs and paybooks show rum not only as a commodity, but as a rationary input. The movement of barrels below deck was a part of provisioning calculations, and the liquid itself became a medium of exchange in many Atlantic ports. In places where coins were scarce, spirits circulated as money. Small casks of rum bought labour, paid debts, and bon lubricated deals. The proximity of rum to currency was practical. Barrels were storable and transportable, and could be consumed or resold on short notice. They conveyed value in colonial economies where specie was thin. Back in European cities, the growing ubiquity of distilled spirits, brandies, arracs, schnapps, and finally the cheap domestic spirit that stoked the English gin craze, reconfigured urban life. Taverns, alehouses, inns, and the newer coffee houses were not simply places to drink. They were nodes of information, credit, and sociability. They were stages where men, and sometimes women, negotiated business, read the news, exchanged letters, and found lodgings. The English alehouse and tavern had medieval roots, but the 17th and 18th centuries saw them evolve into complex institutions. Coffee houses, arriving in London in the 1650s, thanks to figures like Pasqua Rosé, an Armenian servant to a Levant Company merchant who opened a coffee house in 1652, offered an alternative to alehouses, quiet light, newspapers, ledgers, and a clientele that prized conversation. It is no accident that Lloyd's Coffee House, founded by Edward Lloyd around 1688, became the nucleus for shipping insurance and later an institution that would be the seed for Lloyd's of London. Coffee houses were instrumental in the formation of what later theorists called the public sphere, places where commercial actors, intellectuals, and political agents met to debate, exchange news, and form opinion. They were, in their different ways, instruments of urban logistics. A merchant could learn about a convoy, insurance rates, or the outcome of a distant battle before his competitors if he knew the right coffee house. Yet not all of these public spaces enjoyed a reputation for civic virtue. Alehouses served local communities and were often centres of gossip and rough sociability. Taverns functioned as posting places for commercial notices and as meeting houses for guilds, but they could also be sites of dispute and disorder in eyes of magistrates. When distilled spirits, especially cheap grain-based gin in England, flooded the market, social anxieties crystallised. The English gin craze of the early to mid-18th century is an instructive example of how state policy, market conditions, and urban demographics intersected. A combination of permissive licensing in the late 17th century, cheap grain supplies, and a burgeoning urban population in London created a market for inexpensive spirit distilled locally or imported as Genva from the Netherlands. The policy calculus of the state mattered. Officers and farmers of excise occasionally encouraged domestic distillation to reduce the market for imported French brandy and to keep grain in value. The result was a spiralling consumption in the poor districts of London, where gin became cheaper than beer and available in corner houses, often served to women and families as much as to men. The response from the elites was swift and savage in rhetoric. Artists and pamphleteers conjured images of Gin Lane, the famous 1751 engraving by William Hogarth, which satirised and condemned the supposed social collapse created by gin's ubiquity. Politicians passed a series of Gin Acts, 1729, 1736, 1743, and finally the more enforceable measure of 1751, trying to curb sales. The Sussex Act in particular imposed licence fees and duties that were punitive in theory. In practice, enforcement collapsed into bribery and evasion, and the Act's severities only stiffened popular resentment. The 1751 Act took a somewhat different tack. It simplified enforcement through local magistrates and made it more difficult for small unlicensed sellers to operate. The results were not immediate moral transformation, but they did reduce the sheer number of gin retailers and contributed, in combination with rising wages and changing tastes, to a decline in the worst excesses within decades. The politics here were not purely moral, they were fiscal and social. An excise that regulated gin, was a lever of state control over an ever-growing urban mass, and licensing became a way of surveilling and disciplining the urban poor. There is a thin, ironic kindness in the state's approach. Tax and control are not always about virtue so much as about order and revenue. Public anxieties about drunkenness did not arise in a vacuum. They were entangled with class dynamics and the formative politics of the early modern city. Taverns could be places of democratic exchange, where tradesmen met, where pamphlets circulated, where petitions were drafted, and they could be places of sedition by the same token. Magistrates and elites worried about assemblies that mix classes and produce collective action. In colonial America, the tavern's civic dimension is clearly visible. The Green Dragon Tavern in Boston, the City Tavern in Philadelphia, and numerous roadside inns were meeting points for political clubs, committees of correspondence, and networks that would later animate revolutionary mobilization. Coffee houses and taverns provided infrastructure for rumour and planning. Their spatial distribution across town maps linked neighbourhoods into intelligible communication networks. In such venues, information flowed as readily as spirits. A merchant in a London coffee house might learn the latest freight rates. A New England tavern goer might hear news of a British naval move. Both pieces of information could be converted into action, and sometimes into political decisions. Another dimension of this urban culture was the emergence of a classed taste in beverages. The coffee house, tea room, and assembly room became part of polite society's constellation, spaces where order, civility, and restraint were practiced and displayed. The tavern and alehouse were more mixed, often reflecting local economies and local sociabilities. Brandies and wines remained associated with elite refinement and continental travel. Beer and ale were staples of everyday life for the majority of Europeans, while distilled spirits, when cheapened and commodified, often became the drink of the dispossessed. This differentiation carried political meaning. Elites, who feared the mixing of classes in the alehouse, feared the political consequences of a populace that could gather, talk, and act. Throughout these shifts, taxation and regulation continued to bend consumption patterns. Governments discovered that by taxing, licensing, or subsidising certain beverages, they could shift demand, protect favoured producers, and fill treasuries. The Navigation Acts, mercantilist tariffs, and specific duties, like the Molasses Act of 1733 and its successor, the Sugar Act of 1764 in the American colonies, show how alcohol and its raw ingredients were instruments of imperial policy. Merchants and planters learned to game these rules. Smuggling networks flourished where duties were high, and the state learned that law was only as effective as customs officers and local magistrates allowed it to be. The politics of excise were, in short, a politics of enforcement and local compromise, not only of national design. By the time the 18th century had given way to the 18th and 19th century transformations beyond our present chapters, the technologies markets, and public institutions shaped by distillation and by the sugar-rum complex had carved deep grooves in the economic and social landscape. The alembic had become a global technology. A chemist in Cairo, an apothecary in Montpellier, a planter in Barbados, and a mason in London all operated within a world that had learned how to turn liquid into vapour, and vapour back into a concentrated resource. Those vapours fueled ships, filled coffers, lubricated trades, and knitted empires. They also filled taverns, reshaped family life in urban parishes, and provoked new forms of civic anxiety and state intervention. And so when you imagine the slow, technical invention of distillation, pieces of glass soldered together, a copper coil catching the first clear drops of condensed spirit, you should also imagine how those clear drops navigated the largest flows of commerce in early modern history. A single technology can be small in design and enormous in consequence. The alembic is proof of that. It made possible a class of goods that fit into kegs and dreams alike, goods that became mediums of exchange, instruments of empire, and the catalyst for new forms of public sociability. From the alembic to the sugar mill, from the trader's ledger to the tavern tally, the story of distilled alcohol in the early modern world is a story of movement, of knowledge, of goods and people. It is a story in which laboratories and plantations are two sides of the same map, one where scientific curiosity meets the coarser arithmetic of profit. Each step was technological, logistical, and fiscal. Each step remade how people drank, how they worked, and how they governed. And in the quiet of a late hour, when a candle will burn low and the city hum has grown distant, one can see how these things connect. An instrument that concentrates vapour becomes a commodity that travels the ocean. A commodity enters a city and remakes a street. A remade street becomes a forum for argument and sometimes outrage. The slow heat of copper pans and the slow tooth of the windmill in a plantation's yard both counted. The tavern, the alehouse, the coffee house, each of these spaces conditioned experience in a city where paperwork and rumour mattered as much as barrels and ropes. Coffee houses invited the early modern reader into a world of print and pamphlet. Taverns invited the ship's mate and the shopkeeper into dispute and negotiation. Both were woven into the public life of towns because they were efficient nodes for information and exchange. The rise of newspapers, too, was bound up with these venues. A penny bought a cup and often a feuilleton of news, and news moved fast. It is telling that by the end of the 17th century, commercial insurers and trading syndicates used coffee houses as meeting places where risks were underwritten and information shared. Financial institutions then took root in places where the aroma of drink mingled with the scratch of quills. In the end, it is the collision of the technological and the social that marks these chapters of alcohol's history. Distillation was a technical advance that reshaped medicine, commerce, and everyday life. The Atlantic sugar economy turned a regional byproduct into a global commodity, rum, whose very logic depended upon ships, warehouses, and credit. Urban taverns and coffee houses then absorbed these commodities into social practices, breeding new forms of public life and prompting new regulatory responses. Regulatory regimes, taxes, licenses, prohibitions, were as much about raising money and preserving order as they were about moral reform. They were instruments in the hands of states learning, often haltingly, how to govern larger and more mobile societies. The slow, steady movement from Hellenistic experiment to Islamic refinement to European application is a narrative of technologies going to work in the world. Copper and glass, heat and vapour, crop and press, barrel and ledger. Those are the instruments that in patient increments remade what people drank and what drinking meant. The 19th century remade the very machinery of taste, and breweries that once smelled only of grain sweat and the warm yeast breath of fermentation began to hum with gears and steam, their rhythms synchronized to the thud of pistons rather than the footfalls of coopers. Steam engines, first tamed for factories and ships, found a welcome home in mash tuns and malt houses, driving roller mills that ground barley more finely, powering pumps that moved hot wort with a cleanliness and speed impossible by hand, and lifting vast mechanical stirrers into copper kettles, where a few decades earlier a village ale was the craft of a handful of hands. An industrial brewery could now move tons of malt and hops through the process in a single day. In England, the great Burton-on-Trent breweries, Bass, Allsop, and others, expanded not only in size but in reach, exploiting local water heavy in gypsum to make pale ales that kept well in transit. Bass's Red Triangle would become one of the first trademarks registered under Britain's new trade laws in the 1800s, a quiet testament to how production at scale and brand recognition were beginning to talk to one another across oceans. In Bavaria and Bohemia, too, the soundscape shifted. By mid-century, lager breweries were beginning to think like factories, using mechanized malt kilns and coordinated teams to meet demand from growing cities and a restless imperial trade. That industrial thinking, however, needed winter, literally. The central technical obstacle to lager, fermentation by bottom-fermenting yeasts and long conditioning at cool temperatures, had meant centuries of using caves and cellars or the seasonal hush of winter. In Plzeň in 1842, a Bavarian brewer named Josef Groll mixed pale malts, soft water, Saaz hops and Bavarian lager yeast and brewed what would become Pilsner Urquell. a beer whose clarity and bitterness demanded consistently cold cellars to mature. For much of the 19th century, such beer's distribution remained local or seasonal. Then mechanical refrigeration, advanced and popularised by engineers such as Carl von Linde in the 1870s, changed the game. Refrigeration machines let brewers control temperature year-round, bring lagering out of caves and into climate-controlled tanks, and place cold conditioning rooms where once only cool hillsides or subterranean vaults would do. With refrigeration, the technical requirement that tethered certain styles of beer to particular landscapes loosened. Lagers could now be brewed reliably in Hamburg, Chicago, or Melbourne, and the taste that had been regional began to become global. Behind refrigeration stood a series of intersecting scientific breakthroughs. Louis Pasteur's mid-century studies of fermentation stripped away superstition. Yeasts were not ghosts of the mash, but living organisms whose work could be studied, harnessed, and above all protected from spoilage. Pasteur's experiments pointed brewers toward heat and cleanliness, toward an understanding that careful control of microorganisms would increase shelf life and allow beer to travel. At Carlsberg in Copenhagen, J.C. Jacobsen had already set up a laboratory in the 1870s. There, Emil Christian Hansen isolated pure yeast strains in the 1880s, solving another headache for industrial brewing, the capriciousness of spontaneous fermentations. With pure cultures, pasteurization to kill unwanted bacteria and controlled cold conditioning, brewers achieved reproducibility. You could now order the same pale, clean lager in 2 cities because the yeast strain, the fermentation temperature, and the bottling process had been standardized. Science had gifted mass production a taste profile. Mechanization finished the story and made it marketable. The Crown Cork, patented by William Painter in 1892, sealed bottles tightly and cheaply. Michael J. Owens's automated bottle blowing and bottling machines in the first years of the 20th century substituted glass made by steel and flame for hand-formed relics, and conveyor belts whirred with identical bottles lined up for pasteurization and label. Railroads and refrigerated railcars carried cases of beer and crates of bottled spirits across continents as confidently as they carried coal and timber. Firms with capital invested in the refrigerated wagons and centralized breweries could undercut smaller local concerns. Adolphus Busch in St. Louis stitched refrigeration, pasteurization, and rail logistics into a strategic whole at Anheuser-Busch, creating a Budweiser that could travel reliably through the American continent at a time when transportation logistics were becoming national strategy. In Milwaukee, breweries such as Schlitz and Pabst harnessed similar tricks, branding, refrigerated distribution, and mechanized bottling, to claim markets in the United States and beyond. Scale, of course, invites the machinery of persuasion. Brands became promises shaped by design as much as by fermenting vats. The late 19th century saw the growth of sophisticated advertising practices that were inseparable from the rise of mass literacy, colour lithography, and a bustling consumer press. Bass's red triangle was not just a mark on a cask. It was an early exercise in the new language of trademarks and the visual assurance of uniformity. Brewers and distillers deployed everything from trade cards and calendars to glassware, illuminated signs and circus posters to saturate the streets and taverns with logos and slogans. Pabst wrapped blue ribbons around its bottles and told stories of awards. Schlitz proclaimed scientific sanitation and used a campaign line, the beer that made Milwaukee famous, to tie civic pride to a mug. Guinness, which had long been associated with Dublin, turned coat of arms and wholesome health claims into an international identity, while Johnny Walker, Jameson, and other spirit houses made blending and consistency the centerpieces of their reputations, marketing Scotch and Irish returns to colonies and metropoles as both safe and respectable indulgences. Those marketing strategies did more than sell a drink. They reshaped taste. Advertising taught millions that lager meant modernity, clarity, and refreshment, that bottled beer had become the polite lunch-tabled option for a growing urban workforce, and that a bottle's label signalled a consonant experience no matter where one lifted it. The tied house system in Britain, and its corollary, brewery-owned saloons in the United States, emerged as a business model for ensuring that this message reached the bar stool. Breweries bought pubs and saloons, set their taps and menus, and turned the point of sale into a distribution channel. Vertical integration reduced variability because the brewer controlled what hit the glass. It also foreshadowed corporate consolidation, as breweries absorbed competitors, standardized operations, and pooled capital to invest in transportation, advertising, and the new science of quality control. Cheap, standardized alcohol changed cities in ways both obvious and subtle. Where once many urban centres were dotted with artisan alehouses and neighbourhood casks, they now featured long rows of saloons, beer gardens, and tied pubs that catered to wage earners, clerks, and the new middle class. Public houses became workplaces of a kind, social hubs where wages were spent and municipal news was exchanged, but they were also sites of anxiety for reformers who saw standardized, mass-produced alcohol as a democratizing and sometimes a dehumanizing force. Drinking patterns shifted toward regularity. The perishable local brew gave way to something that could be purchased in a bottle, carried home, and consumed on a regular schedule. Women's relations to alcohol changed too, sometimes becoming more visible in beer gardens and temperate saloons, sometimes pushed back into private by social pressure. Employers grew attentive to the sober worker and the cost of drunkenness. Some industrialists sponsored temperance or wet economies within factories, offering alternatives to saloon culture that would keep the workforce sober and productive. Progress, therefore, sat beside a moral panic. That panic had been growing for generations before the age of steam and pasteurization. Temperance movements did not spring from nowhere. They were the long-running reply to the social disruptions of industrialization, urban crowding, and a moral culture increasingly anxious about public order and family life. In the United States, the American Temperance Society, founded in 1826, sought to make moderation a civic virtue. The Washingtonian movement of the 1840s added a testimony style and the notion that personal narrative could convert the way people drank. By the late 19th century, women had become central to the fight. The Woman's Christian Temperance Union, formed in 1874 under leaders such as Frances Willard, linked temperance to suffrage, domestic welfare, and the protection of children, and offered a new political muscle to anti-liquor campaigns. The Anti-Saloon League, organised in 1893, turned those energies into focused political pressure, training organisers, lobbying state legislatures, and making local referendums an instrument of change. They used the new tools of mass politics, petitions, newspaper campaigns, and alliances with anti-immigrant or religious constituencies to paint alcohol not simply as a personal vice, but as a public health and public order menace. The turn from moral suasion to statutory action culminated with experiments in prohibition and strict regulation in the early 20th century, most notably the American experiment that would become prohibition. In 1919, the United States ratified what history would call the 18th Amendment, and in the same breath, Congress passed the Volstead Act to define and enforce the ban on intoxicating beverages. The law went into effect in January 2020. For nationalists, for suffragists who hoped for a more disciplined public sphere, for rural evangelicals wary of urban saloons, and for progressives convinced that alcohol undercut workplace efficiency and family life, the measure was an act of collective rationality. For the beverage industry and for many ordinary citizens, it was a cataclysm. The legal ban did not end demand. It redirected it into shadow economies that were efficient in ways the law had not anticipated. Where an open market had once been regulated primarily by price and local custom, a prohibited market required networks, concealment and mobility. And those are precisely the features that organised crime is good at exploiting. Speakeasies proliferated in basements and behind bookcases in cities across the United States, while rum runners packed fast boats with alcohol smuggled from the Caribbean and the Canadian Maritimes. Moonshiners in Appalachia and other regions continued to distill illicit spirits locally. Both ended up relying on complex logistics. Barrels concealed under false bottoms, creative labelling, networks of bribed officials, and they attracted entrepreneurs who were willing to use violence as a business tactic. Chicago's Al Capone is the most infamous emblem of that transformation. Once the saloon was illegal, the supply chain contracted into a machine that produced not only cocktails but corruption, murder, and municipal rot. When Capone was finally incarcerated in 1931, it was for tax evasion, an anticlimactic end to a criminal career fueled by the demand Prohibition had not erased. The American experiment was not alone. Finland took the most uncompromising turn in Northern Europe, instituting national prohibition in 1919 that lasted until 1932, a period during which smuggling with Estonia and Sweden thrived and illicit markets grew. Norway and Iceland enacted temperance and partial bans in the 1910s and 1920s, and Sweden, after a major referendum in 1922 in which voters rejected total prohibition, pursued a system of state control and rationing. Canada experimented with provincial prohibition regimes, while in many parts of the British Empire, local restrictions, licensing laws, and a temperance movement affected colonial administration and local customs. The lesson became visible. Outright bans displaced consumption rather than eliminating it, often creating violent, clandestine economies that were difficult to control and easy to tax once legal frameworks returned. The policies of this era left layered legacies. In the United States, the failure of prohibition to eliminate drinking, combined with the fiscal realities of the Great Depression, helped generate the political will to repeal the 18th Amendment in 1933 through the 21st Amendment, which returned alcohol policy largely to the states and created a patchwork of regulations and licensing systems. The federal era of prohibition had spawned federal enforcement agencies, and some of them lived on, mutated into other forms of criminal investigation, and taught law enforcement a great deal about interdiction and corruption. Internationally, temperance's moral rhetoric evolved into more pragmatic public health frameworks. By mid-century, experts increasingly treated alcoholism as a medical and social problem, not merely a moral failing. The founding of Alcoholics Anonymous in 1935 in Akron, Ohio by Bill W. and Dr. Bob crystallized the therapeutic approach, creating a language of recovery and a para-religious support structure that persists today. Prohibition had, perversely, a creative side. The very coercion that drove alcohol underground also transformed the forms in which Americans drank. Speakeasies needed drinks that masked rough liquors, and that pressure fostered ingenuity at the bar. If bathtub gin tasted like despair, then citrus, sugar, bitters and liqueurs became alchemy. Bartenders learned to hide defects behind balance. Where the pre-prohibition bar might be a centre of showmanship, think of Jerry Thomas in mid-century America, the flamboyant professor, whose 1862 Bartender's Guide codified recipes and performance. The speakeasy asked for economy and elegance in equal measure. A new culture of mixed drinks, measured and salted with syrups and citrus, emerged to meet the illicit palate. That culture, in fact, has much longer roots and many branching stems. Cocktailing as an art reaches back into the 19th century and the boom of printed recipe books. Jerry Thomas, an itinerant showman who worked in New York and San Francisco and then published in 1862, is often held up as the father of American mixology. He mixed, indeed, but he also wrote the formulas and theatricalized the act, turning the bartender into an artisan whose tools were a bar spoon and a muddler rather than just a cask. In the later 19th and early 20th centuries, cocktails like the Sazerac, born in the early 19th century in New Orleans, an elder statesman of the genre made with cognac or rye and bitters, and the Manhattan, which tradition attributes to a club in New York in the 1870s, became part of an urban ritual. The martini, whose etymology is contested and which may have evolved from earlier drinks called a martinez, took shape in the late 19th century as a distilled, cold, dry expression of modernity, a single drink that said thinly that the drinker knew something about the city. After the repeal of Prohibition, and through the mid-20th century, cocktails did not simply come back. They multiplied stylistically. The cocktail bar became a marker of cosmopolitan taste. London's Savoy Hotel, with the American-born Harry Craddock behind its stick after the Great War, gifted the world with the Savoy Cocktail Book in 1930, a compendium that preserved classical formulas and a certain lounge elegance. Meanwhile, in the United States, the cultural imagination began to flirt with the exotic, and Polynesia, or an American simulacrum of Polynesia, became a shared fantasy. Don the Beachcomber, born Ernest Raymond Beaumont Gant, but rechristened as Don Beach, opened his first tiki bar in Los Angeles in the mid-1930s, draping the room in bamboo, masks and dark rum. Victor Bergeron, known to the world as Trader Vic, opened a chain of restaurants that polished and popularised the aesthetic and claimed the invention of the Mai Tai in 1944, a claim contested by Don Beach and others. The Mai Tai, made with rum, lime, orange, curacao and orgeat, was both a beverage and a story about faraway places sold to mainland Americans who had just seen the Pacific at close range during the war and wanted the warm memory bottled for their martini glasses. The tiki phenomenon was more than a set of tarnishes and papier-mâché decor. It was a social commentary. It embraced post-war mobility, the fascination with the Pacific and Hawaii's statehood in 1959, and a certain playful consumerism that could both celebrate and simplify other cultures for domestic consumption. The drinks were often complex blends of rums, syrups, citrus, and bitters, designed for communal consumption at the bar and engineered to be sweet, strong, and theatrical. The Zombie, Don Beach's fearsomely alcoholic creation, had rules and rituals. It came with caution signs. It was the perfect mid-century embodiment of the age's contradictions, a desire for controlled pleasure in a world newly concerned with order and appearance. Across the Atlantic and in urban centres everywhere, the martini endured as the cocktail of polish and masculine sophistication, an icon of mid-century lounges, where men in suits and women in beaded dresses gathered under low lights. Hollywood exported those images, advertising sold them. And yet for all its glamour, mid-century cocktail culture also suffered from the era's industrial efficiencies. Ready-mix concoctions, cheap liqueurs and pre-batch syrups crept into hotel bars and lounges. By the 1970s and 1980s, cocktail quality suffered in many quarters, displaced by neon, frozen daiquiri machines and the convenience of mass-market sweeteners. The revival that has shaped most of the last quarter century is paradoxically both restorationist and revolutionary. Beginning in the late 80s and accelerating through the 90s and into the 2000s, bartenders and writers began to coax pre-prohibition recipes back into contemporary practice, treating them with the laboratory's respect for technique and an artisan's devotion to ingredient quality. Dale DeGroff, who in the late 80s and 90s presided over the cocktail program at New York's Rainbow Room, is often credited with restoring a sense of magic to the craft. He insisted on fresh juices, proper ice, classic tools, and historical fidelity. In the late 90s, Sasha Petrasky created Milk and Honey in New York, a small rule-bound bar that emphasized precision, simplicity, and hospitality. Its philosophy spread like yeast, training a generation of bartenders to revalue balance, dilution, and the whisper of a good bitters. David Wondrich, through scholarship and books such as Imbibe, turned the lawyer's desk into a bartender's archive, making the past not a museum, but a recipe book. Modern bartending became an industrial critique. Small batch syrups, house-made tinctures and aged cocktails and fat-washed spirits were deliberate replies to the factory taste of mid-century mixers. At the same time, the global supply chains that had been built for beer now offered bartenders access to rare rums, cacao, exotic citrus and agave spirits, inspiring new signatures and revivals alike. Contemporary creations, the Penicillin by Sam Ross, a Scotch and ginger hybrid that feels like a snug medicinal comfort. The Last Word, a pre-prohibition gin and chartreuse concoction revived by craft bartenders in the early 2000s, slot into a lineage that stretches from Jerry Thomas's flamboyance to Don Beach's inventiveness. The new craft distilling movement, which grew in tandem with craft breweries and micro-wineries, provided a complementary supply of small-scale whiskies, gins and rums for cocktail bars to work with, fueling experimentation and local identity. A new wave of aesthetics also returned to the public stage, speakeasy-style bars with unmarked doors and telephone reservations, molecular mixology with foams and clarified juices inspired by culinary modernists, bars that practice zero waste and ingredient traceability, and lounges that revive the ritual of the bar as theatre. Branding too has returned, this time in the hands of boutique producers who sell stories of terroir and handcraft against the mass backdrop they once helped create. Corporations adapted as well. Multinational spirits groups consolidated brands, invested in premium luxury marketing and opened flagship bars where brand identity is curated like any museum exhibit. The scale and logistics of the 19th century, it seems, were never truly abandoned. They were repurposed. Through all this, the cocktail remained a mirror to society. It reveals how cities absorb foreign tastes and recode them as local pleasures, how prohibition and regulation move appetite out of sight and consequently sharpen culinary ingenuity, and how science and capital can make an ale taste the same from Manchester to Milwaukee while advertising persuades us we are buying something unique. Cocktail culture has been a practice of adaptation, a form of taste that borrows from imperial supply chains and local orchards alike, that plays with identity and performance, that alternately masks and displays potency. It has also raised ethical questions, tiki's appropriation of Polynesian imagery, the colonial histories embedded in rum and sugar, and the ways in which branding simplifies complex agricultural and social histories into a tidy label. If we step back and listen to the long arc, the hiss of steam in a Burton brewery, the whine of a refrigeration compressor in Copenhagen, the clink of newly crowned bottles marching down a conveyor in St. Louis, the furtive downtown door where a bootleg knock yields a gin and citrus salvation, and the low, attentive murmur of a modern bar where a mixologist measures bitters like a jeweller weighs metal, we hear a single continuing melody. Technology made alcohol reliable and mobile, and mass production made it common. That commonness provoked moral and political responses that attempted suppression, and in many cases, achieved regulation rather than eradication. Prohibition, with all its ironies, taught governments the limits of coercion and the complexities of human desire. Temperance taught societies to imagine alcohol as a public health problem and not merely a private failing. And cocktails, whether the smoky Sazerac of New Orleans, the effervescent daiquiri of Havana, the theatrical zombie of Don Beach, or the micro-distilled gin stirred with microscopic care, or have proven to be a cultural barometer. They can soothe, celebrate, conceal, and reveal. So the story travels on, an industry of taste and engineering braided to a social life that keeps changing its hours. A brand registers a mark and imagines loyalty across oceans. A chemist isolates a yeast and promises reproducibility. A reformer dreams of sobriety for a nation and discovers black markets are good at keeping secrets. A bartender learns an old recipe and teaches it again. Each of these acts is small and practical and enormous at once. They have shaped how cities sound at night, how families count their wages, how nations legislate desire, and how strangers sit at bars and tell one another about their day. Drink, like sleep, is one of the ordinary rituals we return to, and it has always been shaped by the machines and the men and women who sought to make it safe, profitable, fashionable, and sometimes illegal. Now, if you listen closely in any city, you will still hear the echoes. A frosty glass slipping into a hand, a bottle cap popping off with a small civilized sound, a bartender shaking metal against metal, all of it part of the noisy human procession that began in wooden brewhouses and ran, by way of engines and laboratories and law courts, into the polished bars we choose today. The 19th century factories made uniformity possible. 20th century politics taught regulation. Prohibition taught resilience and invention. The cocktail taught us to balance bitterness with sweet and to find sociability in a shared glass. It is a long line, and it is still being poured. The 20th century turned alcohol from a private pleasure, a locally negotiated ritual, into an object of national statistics and public policy, measured on scales and graphed in papers, debated in committees and courtrooms, and argued over in the sober light of epidemiology as well as the smoky backrooms of industry headquarters. The century opened with temperance movements and ended with epidemiologists and neuroscientists speaking with authority. In between, it had episodes of experiment and retreat, most dramatically in the United States, where the 18th Amendment ratified in 1919 and the Volstead Act that enforced it in 1920 tried, with a single decisive stroke, to remove distilled and fermented beverages from everyday life, only to be followed by the messy, partial return of the 21st Amendment in 1933. Prohibition was not simply moral drama, it was logistics. The redirecting of grain supplies, the retrenchment of ports, the closure of taverns, the birth of illicit distribution networks. It was also a public health experiment that left deep lines on regulatory thinking. After repeal, governments were less willing to cede alcohol wholly to private commerce. They began to think of consumption as a matter for policy design. Once the smoking gun of partisan reform quieted, science took a clearer seat at the table. Medicine and public health institutions sharpened the language. Alcoholism became not only an act of sin, but a syndrome to be studied, quantified, screened for, and, with mixed success, treated. E. M. Jelinek's work in the mid-century, a name often mentioned in the literature as a touchstone for the disease concept of alcoholism, helped push clinicians and policymakers toward the idea that patterns of drinking could be parsed, classified, and perhaps medicated. In Washington, the US, Congress created the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism in 1970, a bureaucratic signpost that the state would collect data on alcohol-related harm, fund laboratories and clinics, and frame public health messages. Across the Atlantic, the World Health Organization began to press member states to treat alcohol as a global public health problem rather than a purely private choice. Epidemiology, the slow-moving engine of 20th century health knowledge, reconfigured how societies understood alcohol. Large cohort studies, such as the Framingham Heart Study begun in 1948, and later numerous national registries, mapped patterns of consumption against mortality and morbidity. They found relationships that were stubborn and complicated. Heavy drinking tracked with cirrhosis and trauma, lifetime patterns predicted social outcomes, and moderate drinking sometimes correlated with lower rates of coronary disease. The latter finding, repeatedly reported from the 1970s onward in population studies in the United States and Europe, became the seductive public story. Red wine, a glass a night. The French who eat fatty food and yet have fewer heart attacks. In 1992, Serge Renaud and colleagues crystallized that narrative into the phrase the French paradox, sparking waves of headlines and a new industry of research into polyphenols and resveratrol. Scientists in small laboratories began measuring tiny molecules in grape skins and linking them, in press releases and journal articles, to cardioprotection. The nuance was often left out of the headlines. Association was not causation, and the observational studies that suggested protection could not fully account for confounding wealth, lifestyle, diet, exercise, and the inconvenient fact that people who drink moderately are often different in many ways from people who do not drink at all. At the same time, solid evidence accumulated about alcohol's harms. By the late 20th century, international agencies, cancer registries and hepatologists were clear. Chronic heavy drinking caused liver cirrhosis, and alcohol increased risks for cancers of the oral cavity, esophagus, liver, and, increasingly convincingly, the breast. Biomarkers, gamma-glutamyl transferase and carbohydrate-deficient transferrin among them, moved from the research bench into clinical practice as imperfect but useful tools to identify hazardous use. Diagnostic manuals evolved. Psychiatric classifications in DSM-3 and 80 and later editions made dependence a clinical category, while the World Health Organization's audit screening tool, developed in 1989, offered a public health-friendly checklist for primary care. Treatment options multiplied. The aversive drug disulfiram had been with clinicians since the mid-20th century. Naltrexone, approved for alcohol dependence in the 90s, promised to blunt craving for some patients. Psychosocial approaches and mutual aid groups, Alcoholics Anonymous, founded in 1935 and spreading globally, continue to coexist with pharmacology. Policy kept pace in fits and starts, shaped as often by tragedy as by evidence. The rise of the automobile and the dawning recognition of alcohol-related traffic mortality moved drunk driving from accepted risk to criminal offence. Mothers Against Drunk Driving, founded in 1980 by Candace Lightner after the death of her daughter, turned private grief into political machinery and helped produce a cascade of changes: stiffer penalties, the normalisation of breath testing, and the push for uniform legal blood alcohol concentration limits. The US Congress in 1984 passed the National Minimum Drinking Age Act, nudging states toward age 21 for purchase of alcohol with the blunt federal incentive of highway funds. Across jurisdictions, gradients of legal BAC drifted downward through the 80s and 90s, as 10 gave way to 0.08% and then, in many places, to still stricter enforcement and lower limits for novice drivers. Random breath testing, pioneered in various forms abroad, caused the probability of detection to rise and the social acceptability of driving after drinking to fall in several countries. Regulation expanded in other directions too. Governments introduced labelling laws that read like modest confessions of culpability. In the United States, the Alcoholic Beverage Labelling Act of 1988 forced packages to carry a federal health warning, most famously the admonition about pregnancy and birth defects. And information about calories and ingredients became an item of contention between public health advocates and producers. France, with its own long-lived love affair with wine, moved in a different register. The Loyevin of 1991 tightened rules on advertising and sponsorship, seeking to excise the glamour that links sports, culture and alcohol in the public imagination. Across Europe and elsewhere, state monopolies, Sweden's Systembolaget, Finland's Alko and similar systems, remained formal instruments of public health, regulating retail outlets and curtailing commercial promotion. Industry and advocates contested these moves with strategies that looked familiar to anyone who had watched tobacco politics. Manufacturers and trade groups funded research, promoted moderation messages, lobbied legislators, and negotiated voluntary advertising codes. The tension was structural. Commercial firms needed robust consumption to underwrite economies of scale and shareholder returns. Health scientists wanted to reduce harm sometime by reducing volume. Where science lowered a caustic lamp and revealed a messy pattern of risks and benefits, industry often seized whatever hopeful finding there was. A correlation suggesting cardiovascular benefit, a study suggesting light consumption could be benign, and built an advertising campaign. The public received mixed signals. One column in the daily paper might celebrate a cardioprotector found in red wine. The next would report a study making a link between alcohol and cancer. In the long run, that noise reshaped perceptions. Moderation became a social norm in rhetoric. Harm reduction became a policy device. But ambiguity left room for industry spin and public confusion. By the end of the 20th century, the interplay among scientific knowledge, commercial interest and regulation had become an archetypal modern story. Witness the courtroom of public opinion. Scientists publishing nuanced papers, industry-funded think tanks offering alternative analyses, activists demanding warning labels and tighter access, courts adjudicating advertising restrictions, and legislatures enacting laws that reflected the relative strength of each coalition. The strategies were logistical as well as rhetorical. Licensing systems controlled outlets, taxes shaped price and consumption. Advertising codes framed messages. Public health surveillance produced statistics designers could use to justify or oppose changes. The scale was national, but the texture remained local. A corner store's hours, a state's licensing hours, a city's permission for a late-night terrace. If the 20th century was about reframing alcohol with scientific instruments and bureaucratic levers, the turn of the 21st would be about reclaiming taste and locality with kilowatt-sized kettles and 50-litre copper stills. The craft revolution began as a countercurrent to industrial standardization. It had a few unmistakable pioneers whose names are now shorthand in the story. Fritz Maytag, who rescued Anchor Brewing in San Francisco in 1965 and kept steam beer alive. Jack McAuliffe, who founded New Albion in 1976 and showed that a tiny brewery could revive old practices and new flavours in Sonoma County. Ken Grossman and Paul Gruenberg, who started Sierra Nevada in Deity and put the American Pale Ale, laced with Cascade hops, on a map. Jim Koch, who launched the Boston Beer Company in 1984 with Samuel Adams and signalled that heritage and recipe could translate into commercial success. In the United Kingdom, CAMRA, the Campaign for Real Ale, formed in 1971, had been defending cask ale against homogenisation for decades, and by the 90s and 2000s that sensibility spread globally. The craft movement took the sensory seriousness of beer, wine and spirits and made it a public virtue. It was not merely a culinary turn, it was logistical innovation. Microbreweries and small distilleries reconfigured supply chains, building relationships with hop growers and maltsters, experimenting with yeast strains, and developing distribution models that relied on tap rooms, farmers' markets and direct sales. Legislation and judicial decisions altered the economics. In the United States, a patchwork of state laws governing distribution and tasting room sales was loosened, state by state. The 2005 Supreme Court decision in Granholm Verhild reshaped direct-to-consumer wine shipping law, allowing many out-of-state wineries better access to consumers and thereby enlarging the market for small producers who previously could not compete at scale. Apps and social networks, Untapped for beers, Vivino for wine, Instagram for aesthetics, amplified local experiments into global trends. A rare saison brewed in a converted warehouse in Barcelona could become a cult object overnight, its photographing and review turning flavour into currency. Small batch distillers rose in the same era, finding niches for artisanal whiskey, moonshine turned legal and refined, and botanically scented gins that prized terroir in the botanicals as much as in grain. The logistics were complicated. Federal excise taxes, state licensing, and the capital costs of stills and cooperage made the early going difficult. Where policy eased, through tasting room licenses, tax differentials for small producers, and favourable grant programs, micro-distilleries proliferated. By the 2010s, craft distilling was not a curiosity. It was a network of hundreds, then thousands of operations in the US, Europe, Australia and beyond. Wine too answered the call for authenticity. The natural wine movement, a diffuse, often disagreeable coalition of chemists, vignerons and bar owners, took hold in regions as varied as Beaujolais, the Loire, Friuli and parts of Italy. Jules Chauvet, a French winemaker and chemist working in Beaujolais, had argued for low-intervention methods in the mid-20th century. Later vintners in the 1980s and 1990s, including producers in Friuli such as those at Radicon, pushed fermentation with indigenous yeasts, minimal sulphur, and extended skin contact. Journalists like Alice Firing in the 2000s amplified these techniques into a movement, sometimes messy and fiercely ideological, that challenged appellation rules and the commercial norms. Critics complained of inconsistency and Brettanomyces. Devotees celebrated texture, place and a supposed honesty of the grape. Barrel-aging innovation swept through beer and spirits with a different logic. The cooper's smell of toasted oak became a new ingredient. Goose Island's Bourbon County Stout, first released in the early 1990s, and turned into an annual ritual, pushed brewers to consider what American oak, ex-bourbon casks or Chevrolet pipes could add to brown beers. Distillers and winemakers began to talk across aisles about finishing whiskies in sherry or port casks, a practice long used in Scotland, but now adopted by producers trying to marry flavours. Small barrels, solar systems borrowed from Spanish sherry production, and cross-category experiments created new product categories. Barrel-aged sour ales, whiskey-finished IPAs, grappa distilled from leftover pomace. The cultural engine driving the craft revolution was partly digital. Instagram turned the carefully curated pour into content, giving craft producers disproportionate reach. Untapped's check-in culture offered social proof. Vivino and other rating platforms translated subjective taste into algorithmic recommendation. Consumers wanted stories as much as liquids: where the barley was grown, who milled the flour for the bakery next door, which cooper had cured the staves. Terroir spread from the vineyards to hop farms and even to yeast strains. The idea that place, microclimate and human touch made a product unreplicable became a selling point in a global marketplace dominated by giant conglomerates. Those conglomerates answered. In the early 21st century, the very forces that craft had challenged moved to absorb it. Multinationals bought small brands, created craft subsidiaries, or imitated artisanal aesthetics. Anheuser-Busch InBev's acquisition of Goose Island in 2011 is a neat, almost comic example. The corporate behemoth owning a brewery that once epitomized craft creativity. Heineken, SABMiller, Molson Coors and others made similar moves, not only buying brands but also investing in distribution networks that could scale small tastes. The collision of independence-minded craftsmen and corporate efficiency created both friction and opportunity. Acquisitions provided capital and reach. They also provoked questions about authenticity and quality control. Regulation continued to shape the terrain. In the United States, small brewers benefited from tax holidays and adjustments. The Craft Beverage Modernization and Tax Reform Act, incorporated into broader tax legislation in 2017, lowered excise taxes for many small breweries and distillers, changing the economics of scale. Across nations, regimes governing labelling, appellations and geographical indications fought to define authenticity. What could be called Scotch, champagne or tequila was a legal matter as much as a gustatory one. These legal borders became marketing lines. Terroir did not only taste, it protected price points and intellectual property. And then the planet changed the rules. The 21st century did what centuries do. It forced producers to account for the material realities of climate, water, soil and the heat. Vineyards that had relied on predictable frost dates and dry summers found weather growing less predictable. The great European heatwave of 2003, which devastated crops across France and Italy, was an early warning. In California, years of drought alternated with years of fires. The Tubbs Fire in 2017 and the Glass and LNU Lightning Complex fires in 2020 made smoke taint a real hazard for vintners in Napa and Sonoma, turning grapes into ash-smelling ghosts that yielded wines with a strange ashy palate. Growers adapted with canopy management, shifting harvest dates to earlier in the season, experimenting with drought-tolerant rootstocks, and, in some cases, moving to higher elevations or latitudes. English sparkling wine, once a curiosity, began to look less eccentric as harvests ripened further north, and vineyards in England, Scandinavia and parts of southern Canada gained attention they scarcely had a decade earlier. Brewers and hop growers felt the pinch too. Hops require water and cool nights. Barley needs consistent growing seasons. Breeding programs work to produce varieties more tolerant of heat and drought, and sourcing strategies diversified. The craft scene's demand for novel hops led to new regions producing distinctive cultivars from New Zealand to Tasmania, from Germany to the Yakima Valley in the United States. Distillers wrestled with water scarcity and energy costs. Some embraced closed-loop systems, heat recovery and anaerobic digestion to convert spent grain into biogas. The language of sustainability moved from marketing copy to engineering manuals. Sustainability certifications proliferated, from organic and biodynamic wine to brewery programs that measured carbon footprints and water use. Those material challenges dovetailed with shifts in taste and social norms. A sober-curious impulse emerged among millennials and members of Generation Z, articulated through movements like Dry January, a campaign recast by the charity Alcohol Concern in the United Kingdom in the 2010s, and popularised in books such as Annie Grace's This Naked Mind and Ruby Warrington's Sober Curious. Non-alcoholic and low-alcohol beverages became not merely an inferior substitute, but a category of its own, invested with craftsmanship. Seedlip, launched in 2015, offered a bottled distilled non-alcoholic spirit, aiming at the cocktail crowd that wanted the ritual without the intoxication. Athletic Brewing, founded in 2017, built a market for non-alcoholic craft beer. Mainstream companies followed. Heineken's 2.0 and similar products aimed to capture a share of the moderation market. Technology made this possible. Reverse osmosis, vacuum distillation, and careful yeast selection allowed producers to remove alcohol while retaining volatile aromas. Biotechnology promised more ambitious disruption. Genetic editing, CRISPR-driven yeast engineering, and precision fermentation opened the theoretical possibility of producing flavour compounds and aroma molecules without the original agricultural inputs. Laboratories began to design yeast strains that produced different ratios of alcohol, esters, and glycerol, aiming to retain mouthfeel while reducing ethanol yield. Other companies worked on synthetic alcohol analogues that might mimic the psychosocial effects of ethanol without the hepatotoxicity. These remain, as of now, experimental and controversial, raising regulatory, ethical, and cultural questions about authenticity. Would wine still be wine if it never touched a grape? European and international regulations, the statutes around geographical indications, appellations, and the legal definition of wine would likely resist a purely lab-made beverage from claiming classical names. The consumer, however, might be more pragmatic if taste, cost, and sustainability aligned. Circular production models migrated from the margins into practice. Spent grain-fed livestock or went into baked goods. Grape pomace found new life as grappa. Compost or high-value extracts. Breweries invested in anaerobic digesters that converted organic waste into methane and fertilizers. Some distilleries used waste heat for on-site greenhouses or neighborhood heating projects. These changes were not merely noble, they were economic necessities in a world of rising resource costs and regulatory pressure to reduce effluent. As drinking cultures globalized, diversity became a new normal. Tequila and mezcal moved from regional Mexican drinks to premium global spirits, their Consejo Regulador and Denominación systems tightening standards while producers diversified styles. Agave shortages in the 2010s, when speculative planting and a spike in demand coincided with disease in agave crops, taught the industry hard lessons about monoculture and supply chain fragility. Japan's highball culture and Korea's soju found international niches. A Korean soju-based cocktail might sit beside a Negroni in a Sydney bar without raising eyebrows. China moved from a statistics footnote to a major market for wine and baijiu. Its influence on price points and styles reshaped global flows of grapes and glassware. Regulation kept following these shifts. Minimum unit pricing for alcohol, a public health policy that aims to raise the floor price, moved from idea to law in places like Scotland in 2018, and the debate over its efficacy continues. Labelling became more forceful in some jurisdictions. Questions about sugars, calories, and health risks moved into packaging, while provenance and supply chain transparency prompted interest in blockchain-based traceability for premium bottles. Governments learned how taxation could be both a revenue instrument and a public health lever. Differential excise taxes rewarded small producers while penalising cheap, high-strength products favoured by harmful consumption patterns. And so the future looks less like a single trend than a braided set of possibilities. Climate will force vines and hop growers into new places, and that geographical shuffle will redraw terroir lines and appellations. Technology, from precision fermentation to gene editing to improved alcoholization techniques, will open technical options for producers while provoking legal and cultural battles over what counts as wine, whiskey, or real cider. Social norms will continue to shift slowly. The young in many countries now drink less and care more about wellness, creating a market for low and no alcohol choices as well as functional beverages that promise mood modulation without the hangover. Regulations will have to balance public health, economic livelihoods and cultural practices with greater nuance. Taxes may be calibrated to harm rather than volume. Labelling may embrace both nutrition and provenance. Licensing may favour local economies and sustainability. There are darker currents too. Industry consolidation will not easily unwind. Powerful producers will continue to shape markets and lobby for favourable rules. New technologies may widen the gap between those who can afford to adopt them and those who cannot. And the old truth remains: alcohol is both intoxicant and commodity, pleasure and risk, private habit and a matter of public consequence. Policy will struggle to account for tastes that are sentimental and commercial interests that are anything but. Still, if the history of the last century teaches anything, it is that societies invent mechanisms to manage the tension. They invent schools and laws, medical disciplines and marketing codes, tasting rooms and taxes. They also invent stories of terroir and tradition, of the scientist's lab and the brewer's copper pot. Those stories are not merely rhetorical garnish.